On November 5th, the final round of U.S. sanctions on Iran go back into effect, part of the Trump administration's withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal. Now, renewed sanctions are already having a dent, or making a dent, rather, in the Iranian and global economy. We've seen companies from India, China, France, all canceling business deals with Tehran. But the sanctions next week are likely to have the most impact because they target Iran's key industry, oil. So will it actually work? First, here's U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton yesterday.
The president said unmistakably our goal is maximum pressure and that it would be to drive Iranian oil exports to zero. We understand, obviously, a number of countries, some in the immediately surrounding Iran, some of which I just visited last week, others that have been purchasing oil, may not be able to go all the way to zero immediately. So we want to achieve maximum pressure, but we don't want to harm friends and allies either. And we're working our way through that.
Well, joining us now from Washington is Alireza Nader. He's the founder and CEO of New Iran and a former advisor to the U.S. government on Iran. And Alireza, of course, the big question now, how effective or not will these sanctions be on Iran when they come into full force?
Hi, thanks for having me. They're definitely going to be very effective. Even in the last few months, in anticipation of these sanctions, the Iranian currency, the rial, has depreciated considerably. Living standards have really declined in Iran. Poverty has gone up. The population is very unhappy at the Islamic Republic. There have been protests and acts of violence by the Islamic Republic against the population. I think the key question for the United States is, will these sanctions induce a change in the Islamic Republic's behavior, support for terrorism, supplying Hezbollah with weapons, supporting the Assad regime, the massive abuses committed against the Iranian people? Will the regime change these policies? And I think right now it's too soon to tell. But I think that there's a tsunami hitting the Islamic Republic, economically anyhow, very soon.
Well, Alireza, on that note, then, in terms of how much the sanctions can really impact the Iranian regime, we've seen sanctions on Iran for a very long time, including before the nuclear deal. Iran still seems to pour billions into its involvement in conflicts from Yemen to Lebanon to Syria. Is there any reason to believe that more economic pressure this time will lead them to change their ways, to turn focus to the Iranian people, for example?
Look, I think the Iranian regime has a choice here. Either it continues its activities abroad and spends billions in Syria and Lebanon and Gaza and Yemen and so on, or it takes care of its own people. A lot of Iranians since December have been going to the streets and saying, leave Syria alone, leave Gaza alone, think of us. And I think this is a major issue in Iran. It's a major political issue, and it's a major source of grievance. So if the Iranian regime keeps up with this, if it keeps building bases in Syria and expanding its military foothold in the region, it's going to face a lot of pressure at home.
Alireza, along with these U.S. sanctions, we know there's this effort by the European signatories, for example, to the nuclear agreement to try to revise it in some manner to keep it alive. Yeah. But that will depend in part on Iran being willing to agree, perhaps to bring in other elements like their missile program. How willing do you think Tehran would be to some kind of change like that?
And this is not a regime that's shown flexibility on these issues. You know, take the recent anti-money laundering law in Iran. It's supposed to address the international community's concerns regarding the Iranian regime's money laundering and terrorism and finance. And they put a stipulation in the bill that would exclude financing Hezbollah and Hamas and the Taliban and other groups. So this is a very ideologically rigid regime. When it's under pressure, yes, it's more willing to negotiate. I think one of the reasons the nuclear agreement was signed was because of these sanctions. But ultimately, I don't think this is a regime that's going to change its policies in a way that really benefits global and regional peace. And I think with this administration in the United States, there's a realization that this regime can't be reformed. It's not going to change. You either put pressure on it and support the aspirations of the Iranian people, or really expect it to continue the way it's been behaving for the last 39 years. But I think this policy of maximum pressure, if it's combined with really strong support, U.S. support and allied support for the Iranian people and the democracy movement in Iran, you could see some major changes in Iran.
Well, I want to ask you, sort of take that a step further. Your most recent piece in the Weekly Standard, you talk about how Washington can try to roll back Iranian influence, and you highlight places like Syria, for example, where Iran certainly has a foothold 7.5 years into that war. We do see, though, the Trump administration sort of taking a back seat there. They have said repeatedly, we're only in Syria to fight ISIS. Do you think that that is a dangerous approach from the Trump White House if you actually need U.S. presence there to counter Iran?
To its credit, the U.S. has decided to keep troops in Syria. It has a lot of allies, especially among the Kurdish Syrian groups. And it's targeting some of Iran's economic activities, for example. Possibly you're going to see policies in which the U.S. targets companies that are rebuilding Assad-controlled areas, driving up the costs for the Iranian regime, because the Iranian regime has been supporting Assad all this time and spending tons of money. And if it wants Assad's territories reconstructed, it has to spend a lot of more money. If the U.S. And its allies really prevent the Syrian regime for reestablishing itself economically. Both the Syrian regime and the Iranian regime want Europe to recognize Assad and invest in Syria. And I think it's very key for the European Union to really not court the Islamic Republic or the Assad regime in any way. And I feel like that Europe has pursued a very disappointing policy. It doesn't acknowledge what's happening within Iran. It doesn't acknowledge the widespread dissatisfaction there. And it's really given the Iranian regime a free pass in the region. And those policies have to change. Europe plays a major role in all of this.
All right. Well, in a few days, when those new sanctions come back into effect, we'll have a little more indication what direction, especially Europe, is going to take.